Good morning. I welcome you to the session panel Monitoring, Preventing and Countering Antigypsyism under the National Roma Strategy Frameworks. I am Guillermo Ruiz, Policy Advisor of the Central Council of German Sinti and Roma. This panel is organized by Ergo Network and by the Central Council. Today, we will focus a discussion on measures that can be implemented at national level to combat antigypsyism under the Roma strategic frameworks. We will discuss which key aspects should be taken into consideration and which good practices have been already put in place at national level, and which role the European Commission, Fundamental Rights Agency, equality bodies, and civil society could play. We have today a very strong panel giving different perspectives from the civil society, EU institutions, and academia. Our first speaker is Bernard Roque, Advocacy and Policy Manager from the European Roma Rights Center. Our second speaker is Angelika Grabher-Busche from the Fundamental Rights Agency. Our third speaker is Tamás Kádár, Deputy Director of Equinet. Our last speaker is Dr. Markus Enz, a member at the Technical University of Berlin at the Antisemitism Research Department, and member of the Independent Commission Antigypsyism at the German Parliament. And the concluding remarks will be made by Isabela Mihalache, Senior Advocacy Officer of Ergo Network, here based in Brussels. Now, let's start with the floor to Bernard.
Thank you, Guillermo. Mindful of the time constraints, I'm just going to jump straight in. I've chosen to deal with just two themes today. First, combating structural racism against Roma, and second, the related issue of civil society monitoring. Now, the European Commission's recognition that anti-Roma racism is deeply embedded in state structures and manifest in multiple forms of institutional discrimination is most welcome. Now, recognition of racism is one thing, but especially at member state level, it does beg the question of the authorities. What you going to do about it? How do you intend to actually dismantle anti-Gypsyism? There is a danger that those in charge will sidestep the need for difficult structural reform and opt instead to address unwitting prejudices and unconscious biases. As critics have warned, this approach denies history, reduces racism to just another bias, and moves the center of gravity back from institutions and structures to the individual, and worse still, to the unconscious. But it was not unconscious bias that made a Czech police officer place his knee on Stanislav Tomáš's neck, or that has led to other Romani deaths in police custody. It's not unconscious bias that orders violent mass police raids on Romani neighborhoods, practices ethnic profiling, or finances the building of ghetto walls to physically segregate Roma from the rest. These are the outcomes of very conscious policies. If we are to be effective in challenging structural racism, we must start with the policies, procedures, and culture of public and private institutions that reinforce forms of racist oppression. I fear that this recognition of institutional racism will not translate into structural reforms at member state level, but rather lead to an epidemic of unconscious bias, diversity, and race awareness trainings for all manner of public officials. This will have little impact, for merely challenging the attitudes and biases of police officers makes no difference as long as racist violence is undergirded by a culture of impunity within law enforcement. Anti-bias training for housing officers won't make a difference to the material impact of racism as long as Roma are routinely denied access to decent housing, clean water and sanitation, endure spatial segregation and live under the fear of forced evictions. Now, in broad terms, the Commission has got it right. Fight institutional racism and discrimination and eradicate the gross inequalities and deprivation that blight the lives of up to 80% of Europe's Roma. And what's required is resolute political action within member states. But in certain key member states, there is a calculation afoot among governing elites. If needs be, get vocal on cultural recognition and periodically extol the virtues of social diversity. But do not expect us to heed your naive leftist calls for an end to racism, poverty, and social exclusion. The bottom line is that beyond a weak rhetoric of recognition, expect little when it comes to meaningful redistribution. This is no good, because to paraphrase Nancy Fraser, a politics of recognition that ignores gross disparities in material well-being dissolves into empty gestures that mock rather than redress serious harms. The message from authoritarian natives in power is even more hardline than mere neglect. For them, the issue of Roma inclusion must be approached on the basis of what Viktor Orban calls the very simple underlying principle. And it goes like this. He said it cannot happen that in order for a minority to feel at home, the majority must feel like strangers in their own towns, villages or homeland, because this is the country of the natives, our country. Now, faced with such a blatant repudiation of European values and Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, in capitals such as Budapest and Sofia, there is concern that there's not much room for meaningful Roma civil society participation. As member states turn in their revised and updated national strategies, it's a good moment to reflect on one kind of Roma participation, and that's to question the very purpose and utility of civil society monitoring. There is an argument that investing so much energy into monitoring no progress, providing evidence and recommendations that are duly ignored, and furnishing reports that have no official standing serves only to co-opt and disempower civil society groups. And the time and effort spent dutifully monitoring the situation on the ground is simply time and effort wasted. Now, I would emphatically disagree and assert that it ain't necessarily so, that Romani activists are not so pliable and unknowing that they can be co-opted so easily. Furthermore, in many member states where politics has not been reduced to a zero-sum game, advocacy and campaigning for social change remains vital. And this involves dialogue and deliberation and ways of working beyond adversarial confrontation. So this is not co-optation. It's rather the case that strategies of struggle and resistance must always adopt circumstance. It's for this reason that every action taken by Roma and pro-Roma civil society groups remains of crucial importance. And this includes the opportunities provided by direct European Commission funding to Roma and pro-Roma civil society groups to build capacity, to challenge exclusion and racism, and to monitor the process in member states up to 2030. The active participation of scores of organisations across the Union lent considerable heft to the findings of the first Roma Civil Monitor. Despite the provisional status of the reports presented a sustained and very public inquiry by broad coalitions of Romani NGOs that highlighted the many failures of governments to honour their commitments to Roma inclusion. The reports also hinted at the huge potential, as yet only partially tapped, for broader civic participation and public debate and dissent on how best to combat not just anti-gypsyism, but all forms of racial discrimination. But we mustn't let the incrementalism of failed frameworks and copy-paste national strategies stunt our emancipatory vision to eradicate racism and poverty and to ensure the fundamental rights of all. Anti-Roma racism, like all forms of racism, must be confronted on the streets, in the media, the arts, the courts, and the legislatures. The way forward lies in broad-based mobilization, everyday solidarity, and political action. We must retain our capacity to be disruptive, to be loud and unruly, to pressure and stress the systems and structures that reproduce racism and inequality. Thank you.
Many thanks, Bernard, for stressing that the need to combat structural institutional anti-Gypsyism, racism, and also for pointing out that social disparities hamper access to equal rights, and that is necessary to continue with a strong advocacy and campaigning for Roma rights. Many thanks, Bernard. Now we go to our second speaker, Mrs. Angelika Grabher-Wusche. She's from the Fundamental Rights Agency. Will speak about the role of the FRA in the monitoring of the EU Framework for Roma Equality and how the FRA is helping member states to collect ethnic data, setting specific Roma indicators. Angelika, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this opportunity to present some insights on the data collection on Roma that the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights is involved in. I would like to start with stating that anti-gypsyism as a concept is very difficult to monitor, and to get this monitoring accepted by a wide political representation is also very difficult. Data, as mentioned earlier, however, is crucial to understand the situation of Roma and to help to determine which policies and measures work and do not work, if they are inclusive and if the money spent on is spent effectively. Data are the basis for informed decisions and guidance to develop policy responses, and data holds us accountable. FRA has invested a lot in the last 10 years to collect comparable and reliable data, to develop methodologies how to collect such data and develop indicators. FRA has been collecting data on perceived discrimination, harassment and violence in service among Roma in a large number of countries in the EU. So this means that FRA has been collecting data on monitoring some forms of manifestations of anti-Gypsyism. This includes both the data on the experiences of Roma with discrimination, harassment and violence in everyday life, as well as unequal access to key public goods like education and health, as well as on the living situation and employment, poverty and social exclusion. The new EU strategic framework for Roma equality, inclusion and participation has set ambitious targets until 2030. Learning from the past, it puts a much stronger focus on data, indicators and monitoring. And the Fundamental Rights Agency, jointly with the Commission, coordinates the Roma Working Party on Roma inclusion indicators. The Roma Working Party was set up to bring together the national Roma contact points and statistical offices to support member states to develop a comprehensive set of indicators to measure progress towards the objectives of the framework. There are 17 headline indicators and supporting indicators across the 7 objectives of the strategic framework. Those indicators are a core EU set. They are valid for all member states. They're comparable between member states. They have standardized definitions, and where possible, they are comparable with the Eurostat inclusion indicators for the general population to be able to identify the gap between the Roma and the non-Roma. They were developed in discussion and in consultation with civil society as well. And of course, member states are encouraged to develop their national indicators to capture more details on the national situation. In the Council recommendation, member states committed to report every 2 years on their progress using these indicators starting in 2023. For now, the Fundamental Rights Agency collects data in around 40 member states, but increasingly member states take up their own data collection. For example, in Slovakia and Bulgaria, they do it already themselves, but also Italy, the Czech Republic, Croatia, Austria take up their own data collections or test the feasibility to do so. We strongly encourage and support national data collections by the member states through for instance, joint projects, provision of supporting documents such as questionnaires and guidelines for the calculation of the indicators. And because of the difficulties to reach out to Roma in most countries for such monitoring purposes, it is crucial to have participatory approaches to develop the data collection in consultation with the Roma civil society and to base the data collection on self-identification. Also, the equality bodies have an important role in monitoring and engagement with civil society in line with their mandates while respecting their independence, in particular by collecting data on hate crime, discrimination and anti-Gypsyism. FRA has a cooperation with equality bodies in the EU. Together with Equinet, we will support the bodies to take up their role under the EU framework. Most important is the role of civil society to support and participate not only in the design of the national strategies, but also in the implementation phase and lastly in the monitoring. FRA has invited civil society organizations to take active part through the Fundamental Rights Platform, the agency's cooperation mechanism with civil society. There will be dedicated meetings to inform civil society timely about development and exchange practices, including monitoring and indicators.
Many thanks, Angelica, for giving us a very interesting overview on this complex field of data collection. Maybe we can come back on some points. Now I will give the floor to Tamás Kádár, who is going to speak about the role of equality bodies by building capacities of civil society organizations to better get involved with the monitoring and data collection processes. Tamás.
Thank you very much, Guillermo, and many thanks for the invitation to speak on this panel. Indeed, I'm representing Equinet, which is the European network of equality bodies. So we have 47 national equality bodies as members. They are public institutions from across Europe. They are promoting equality and fighting against discrimination on various grounds. And they have been working for a long time for Roma equality using their various powers. And I think that, talking a little bit broader than what equality bodies can do to work together with civil society, I think that it's. I would just like to comment on the issue of antigypsyism as a key underlying obstacle to reaching equality for Roma, and I think it was really. Perhaps for some, a rude awakening, as we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, that showed the importance and gravity of this problem even more. Not that anyone should have had a doubt, but we saw the disproportionate vulnerability of many Roma to the virus due to their socioeconomic and health disadvantages, the denial of assistance and access to services, the hate speech and the general negative discourse, and the disproportionate use of emergency powers by law enforcement. And if I'm a pessimist, this, in essence, the existing structural and institutional anti-gypsyism and the lack of willingness by leaders in some member states to achieve real change in the lives of and equality for Roma really calls into question the feasibility of reaching the aims and targets of the EU strategy. If I'm, however, an optimist, which I guess we all have to be some kind of an optimist to work on this field, I hope that COVID-19 can act as a wake-up call, really. We heard it from Michael O'Flaherty yesterday, and Equinet has also been saying that we cannot simply return to the old way of looking at and doing things after the pandemic. We need to learn and take this opportunity to rebuild Europe in a fair and equal manner. But the question is, what is the role of equality bodies in this? And both the EU strategic framework and the Council recommendation make it crystal clear that equality bodies should be involved in the design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of national Roma strategies. And member states should rely on advice from them, and in particular when they are fighting anti-gypsyism. This is why we organized a roundtable in February this year, and Equinet is committed to continue this work to see how we can work towards Roma equality together to implement the EU Roma strategic framework. And we see already that equality bodies already contribute in a number of ways, including being members of institutional structures established for implementing or monitoring the strategy. Some other equality bodies provide independent monitoring and reporting on the strategy, yet others prepare policy recommendations for inclusion in the strategy, and some implement specific actions included in the strategy. This, however, is the experience that we got from the previous EU framework for Roma integration strategies. And I think that we still need to see how far member states really work together and ask for the expertise of equality bodies. We also have some signs that this cooperation and the involvement of equality bodies in the development, implementation, and monitoring of the strategies is not smooth and not optimal. Let's just say that. But equality, I think looking at the title of the session, monitoring, prevention, and countering, I think it's important to see that equality bodies can play a role in all three of these. They have important research powers, so they can gather information, conduct studies to reveal the extent and manifestations of anti-Gypsyism in their societies. They can also collect data on complaints and generally on the situation of Roma in their societies. And they can also, of course, under the Council recommendation, requirement that member states need to involve equality bodies in committees set up for the monitoring of relevant EU funds. I think that this is also a big task and responsibility, but it is also a big opportunity, as the use of these funds, if done properly, can really play a major role in tackling anti-Gypsyism. They can play a role in prevention when they are advising governments, when they are raising awareness about anti-Gypsyism, and also when they work with duty bearers, such as employers and service providers, to spread good equality practices. And I think that we see that this work with duty bearers is, of course, facilitated by the introduction of equality duties in legislation on employers, service providers, and public bodies, where they are required to adopt policies and practices that prevent discrimination and promote equality. Equality bodies are also well known, of course, for their legal powers and the legal work that they do. All of them have a mandate to deal with discrimination using civil and administrative law, and most of them also have a mandate to deal with hate speech, even though this hate speech mandate may not be explicit. They ideally should also have a mandate to litigate or issue legally binding decisions, start own initiative cases, conduct strategic litigation as an effective means to reach an impact that goes beyond the individual case. But the problem is that at the moment, these powers are unfortunately not a given in all jurisdictions. Hate crimes were mentioned, including by Angelica here, and they are also part of the task that is given to equality bodies under the Council recommendation, for instance. But there is a catch there as well, because it puts an expectation on equality bodies, even though the legal mandate of some of the equality bodies may be hard to reconcile with this, as they may not have the possibility to engage in processes under criminal law. So there is some creativity that is needed there as well. And then coming to the cooperation, I think that it's extremely important, and as Equinet we are really trying to push for that there is a close and structured cooperation with civil society. And I would like to underline that when I say that there should be a cooperation, I think that it's really imperative that it's not a one-way or a top-down approach. And equality bodies should enter into a constructive dialogue with Roma and pro-Roma civil society that should include mutual education, where each party shares their unique knowledge, strengthening each other. And this can, for instance, usefully help the participation of NGOs in the Roma Civil Monitor Initiative as well, when they can provide some specific legal knowledge, for instance, or specific anti-discrimination perspectives to NGOs who are doing the Roma Civil Monitor. And it is also essential that equality bodies work closely with and involve Roma in their activities as trainers, as trainees, as valued partners, and also as employees of the equality body. And finally, in terms of the conditions for equality bodies, I think that this is all great, but it is also crucial that the EU strategic frameworks commit to reassess and strengthen the independence, powers, and effectiveness of equality bodies. This is necessary, given that several equality bodies around Europe struggle with securing their full independence, which of course is extremely important for trust building with Roma communities, or to secure the necessary mandates, the necessary powers and resources. And we need to realize that for equality bodies to live up to all expectations regarding their contributions to fighting anti-Gypsyism, they need to be given the necessary human and financial resources, powers, and independence. Failing on any of these will result in lower levels of effectiveness due to financial or personal shortages, inability to engage in certain types of work, or higher levels of underreporting and lower levels of trust towards the body due to the perceived lack of independence. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Tamás. We have observed, we have followed the work of Equinet, trying to push forward among equality bodies the Roma issue for many years. As you mentioned, it's quite difficult when in many countries equality bodies are not adequately equipped and they don't have the resources to carry out their work. Many thanks for your intervention. And now we go to a perspective, to a national perspective, and to a perspective from the academia. We have Dr. Markus. Markus is going to speak. So we're going to speak about the experience of historical appraisal, of new kind of appraisal of the historical dimension of anti-Gypsyism through the independent commission anti-Gypsyism. He's going to discuss if we can consider it as a good practice or not. Markus, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Guillermo. I want to talk a bit about the independent commission as a tool, but also about our findings. Maybe just some context. I think a very important aspect is that the Independent Commission on Anti-Gypsyism in Germany has been lobbied for by the Central Council and other organizations for years. So it's really important that you keep that in mind when Germany is proudly presenting this commission, that it wouldn't have been possible if the civil society, Roma organizations and Sinti organizations wouldn't have lobbied for this, like really hard. But in the end, it was set up by the government, it was supported by the parliament, and it was well funded, and we had a lot of independence to go our own work. We were 11 scholars, also with some activist background. 3 of them were Romani or Sinti scholars, and we worked for 2 years. We discussed a lot, we met a lot of civil society organizations along the way that gave us important input on what's needed, to get to continue. And we had the funding to commission a lot of external research papers in addition to our own expertise, especially on experiences of racism and on institutional anti-Gypsyism. I will come back to this later. First, I want to tell you that we made 6 main recommendations. Some of them are on a rather organizational level, some are on a more political level. The first and second is rather organizational. In Germany, there is a commissioner for the fight against anti-Semitism, and we demand such a commissioner for the fight against anti-Gypsyism on a federal level. That's the first recommendation. And as well, commissioners for the fight against anti-Gypsyism on state levels for all 16 states. And they should coordinate this fight. As very often when you argue with politicians, they would tell you, no, this is impossible on federal level, at state level, or vice versa. And this is why we need such a commission where this can be coordinated. The third is already a bit more political. Even until today, there is no general acknowledgement of all-encompassing acknowledgement of a general persecution of Romani and Sinti people in Germany from 1933. So on a judicial level, they still have to prove individually that they have been persecuted. And this leads to still a lot of fights for compensation to be lost in court. So what we demand is that there is a general acknowledgement that those people, Romani and Sinti communities, have been persecuted from the beginning of National Socialism. And this would also mean direct financial compensation for a lot of people in Germany, but also for a lot of people on a European level. We also make, of course, more detailed recommendations on how to really reach that. The fourth recommendation is a large-scale truth commission working on federal, regional, and local level. It should be community-driven, and what we think is the most important, that this Truth Commission should focus on the injustices against Romani and Sinti communities in Germany after 1945, so that the German state, the German society really acknowledges that those injustices didn't stop, and that it not only acknowledges it like Bernard said in like nice words, but really works through this on a regional level, discussing how did the deportations work, discussing how did the family politics work, how did the housing politics work. And that can, of course, also show some regional differences. The fifth recommendation is pretty easy. We put it in some more words, but the simple sentence is no deportations of Romani or Sinti refugees from Germany. And the sixth is, that's also already mentioned by Bernard, we argue that we need more stable, more effective, more widespread structures of participation for Romani and Sinti communities on all political level. So these are the main recommendations. Let me focus on two more important, but the two most important aspects of our work. The first is also one big external paper we commissioned, and they really researched the experiences of racism for Romani and Sinti people in Germany in qualitative interviews. So they did about 90 interviews, and this is the first time something like this has been done in Germany on such a scope and scale. And it shows that, yeah, those experiences are really encompassing everyday experiences of racism for most of those people. They perceive this racism as a structural racism, and they describe it as intergenerational and intersectional. These experiences until today are still not really heard in Germany. They are not like really accepted and understood. So this is also one aspect of this change of perspective that the Commission has demanded. And the second, and this is really directly supporting Bernard's argument, is the institutional forms of racism. Germany, as many other countries, German society, but also German politics, hasn't really acknowledged that there is a phenomenon like institutional racism. Actually, when we presented the report, the people from the ministry discussed with us our findings, if they really existed. So on a large scale, in my opinion, this is the most important barrier for a better life for many Romani and Sinti people and others experiencing anti-Gypsyism. And this can't be fought in a month or a year. This really needs to change fundamentally. And the first step would be to accept that anti-Gypsyism is not only a prejudice, but it's a really structural phenomenon. It's in my own thoughts, it's in my own institutions. Those institutions are shaped by this. And it's, of course, also not only the police, it's the social work, it's the media, but it's like everyday life. So this, for me, would be the most important aspect. And from my perspective, if you ask me, we are light years away from such a change in perspective. So we in the Commission, I say we, it's my personal opinion, but I think the others would agree, we don't think that the report we made will be accepted and followed by the government or by the political structures, but our perspective was we write the report so that the civil society can continue pressuring the government and say, look, here are the findings, you need to change something, your own Commission stated so much. That's it for me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Many thanks, Markus. Just to mention that the report has around over 800 pages, and we're now expecting what's going to happen with a new government coalition in Germany, on how, because as you said, we have the report and recommendations, and now it's about to to implement them, and we hope that there will be a political commitment of the new government to implement at least the most important recommendations of the Commission. I would like to start with a very short round of reactions and questions, but I would like to start with a question I have to Angelica. Angelica, you mentioned in your presentation that anti-Gypsyism as a concept is quite difficult to monitor in the countries. I would like to ask you why. And the second one is, you said as well that it's quite difficult to to carry out a participatory approach with the communities by monitoring. Can you specify what do you mean with this?
Yes, thank you. As I stated in the beginning, that anti-gypsyism as a concept is very difficult to monitor because different political or different stakeholders and actors at country or across borders have different ideas of how anti-gypsyism manifests itself and what should be monitored. As we heard earlier from Bernard, if we shift the focus from institutional or structural racism and towards unconscious bias, then we lose a lot of action points and action areas, and so it is difficult to determine in a monitoring system what are the institutional hurdles and the institutional barriers to what manifests itself in perceived discrimination, harassment, and violence. So there have to be different strains of collecting data on this. The second point that you mentioned is on the participatory approach. We have seen in countries with less experience in data collection on hard to reach groups as Roma and travelers are, that we are relying. We are relying on the civil society organizations to determine where the areas are we need to survey, or how we can reach Roma and travelers for the surveys, especially in countries where we don't have any sampling frames, or where the establishment of sampling frames is really hard to get by, and there we rely on the knowledge and the cooperation of the civil society to work with us and to make the monitoring happen.
Many thanks, Angelica. And you have the opportunity to react as well, or to complement on maybe Bernard, you want to say something on? No, you're fine. You are muted.
Hi. Yeah. No. I'm happy to answer any direct question, but I fully endorse the earlier comments about the difficulties and the contested. That the notion, even the recognition of anti-gypsyism is contested in many member states. There are, I would say, there are two types of, there's the discrimination that kills. There's the discrimination that forcibly evicts people, that creates that creates zones where visible minorities cannot be, areas in life that they cannot participate in. So there is the sort of forms of discrimination that are a direct assault on the autonomy and dignity of the individual and their personal safety and security. We need to keep in mind the different categories of, however wearing perceived microaggressions are, however sort of exhausting they are to a person's life and well-being. It's quite different category of harassment to firebombing Romani homes and machine gunning the children when they flee the burning house. So our responses need to be tailored to the level of threat and the forms of racist sort of discrimination that people are subjected to. It is easier, so it's quite feasible, and it's not so difficult to monitor direct acts of aggression. It's not impossible to, and we have done it, to monitor the forms of sort of institutional discrimination in hospitals. If Romani women are assaulted and racially abused while they're giving birth and told to shut up or your children will be taken away from you, or there are seemingly neutral regulations in place that disproportionately impact upon Romani people. We can identify these things, and these things can be monitored. So, and FRA has, I must say, over the years, admirably managed to identify and give sort of, with not just the data, but the recommendations and the analysis and the FRA opinions that come with it, has given a concrete shape that is comprehensible to policymakers of what anti-Roma racism, what anti-Gypsyism is. So at this stage, I mean, I think Michael O'Flaherty has said data alone changes nothing, but nothing changes without data. So I borrow that quote because I fully endorse it. We don't have the illusion that, and there is a danger among some kind of number crunchers and sort of technocrats that data collection becomes an end in itself. That people are claiming, we need more data, we need more data. People who are being burnt by a fire know that something's wrong. We have, and the sort of, we need more sort of, we need more people from minority and discriminated groups to be able to gather and generate data to make the argument that they will not tolerate and such injustices should not be tolerated. And yeah, so I think the way FRA has gathered and used data there's no excuse for political leaders to say they don't understand what anti-Gypsyism is. They don't quite get it. They just need to read the reports, read the analysis, read the recommendations. It's there in admirably clear language and very sort of astute analysis of the data that's being gathered.
Mm-hmm. Many thanks, Bernard. I have seen that Markus raised a hand, or I'm right, Markus?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I even fear in Germany there's this debate about setting up monitoring accounts, and I think it's most important that we understand that some forms of institutional racism, they can't be counted on or told for an incident happened on this specific time or day, because they are structural ongoing processes. I mean, the police collects racialized data for decades. It's not an incident, you know? And this is something I think we have to keep in mind when we talk about monitoring, that monitoring is about individual incidents, as Bernard said, but we shall not allow this to shift the focus from this structural aspect that German governments changed laws in order to fight Roma migration, even if they are general laws, but they did this in order to do that. And they did this on the basis of anti-Gypsyist discourses. So those are all aspects that cannot be monitored in a monitor that tells on September 5th, there has been an attack on this person here and there.
Mm-hmm. Many thanks, Markus. Tamás, do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. I think that while data is really important, it really sometimes drives me crazy that you know, there is this call for more and more data, and you know, there is only so much you can register because of what Bernard said and what Markus said just now. There are things that you cannot register, and but it's still, you know, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. And it's just, you know, sometimes you just have this common sense things, and while data is extremely valuable, it can also be abused, I think, in certain cases. And I can give you two quick examples to that. One of them is a general issue about how the complaints data of equality bodies is used. Just because, say, in a country where the population is 10% of the population is Roma, and the equality body receives, let's say, 50 complaints of discrimination against people of Roma origin, that very likely doesn't mean, unfortunately, that there have been only 50 incidents of anti-Gypsyism and racism and discrimination against Roma in that country. It just means that this is what's got reported. However, if a government or any decision maker wants to abuse this statistics, then they can very easily say that, look, statistics show us that it's very few cases that actually are reported. Therefore, there is no discrimination against Roma in the country. So I think that that's a huge fallacy of how data is being used sometimes, unfortunately. And the other example is a personal one. When I went to when I used to work for the Hungarian Equality Body, and I went to a city where we received the complaint of segregation in education, and it was pretty much crystal clear to anyone who has ever set foot in that city that there has been segregation of Roma pupils in the school of that city. The city council very conveniently was pointing at the absence of any ethnic data and said that they never collect ethnic data, therefore they wouldn't know which kid is of Roma origin, and therefore how would it even be possible for them to segregate? That just happened to be the case, that certain kids are in one class and other kids are in another class. So I think that it's also very important to be very cautious about how equality data is being used. And very importantly, I think that there are great materials out there, great analysis, great reports, great data, but really something has to be done. And I think that up to a certain point you can request more data, but at a certain point, as a political decision maker, you will have to act, and you cannot always point to NGOs, policymaker. NGOs and Roma people themselves, equality bodies, whoever else, to collect more and more data.
Angelica, we have 3 minutes left for discussion.
Thank you for the word, and thank you for the valid input. We've mentioned that the data collection is existing already, and Fra has made some progress there, but we can't forget that we still have countries where we have no data at all. So at an international level, we might have data, but at in many member states at national level, we do not have any data. That being said, Fra recently published a guidance note on the collection and the use of equality data based on racial and ethnic origin, which could help in the data collection endeavors. And we would like to emphasize that the participation of the civil society cannot stop at the level of data collection, but it has to go beyond that when it comes to the presentation and the interpretation of the data and the results.
Many thanks, Angelica. And we have many thanks for our presentations. We have discussed very important issues on also the complexity of the subject expressed, for example, in the fact that underreporting of anti-Gypsyism can be a problem to implement policies, and shows how the limits of this issue of data collection in general. I will give now the floor to Isabela Mihalache from Ergo. Isabela, you have the floor for the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. And I would also like to take the opportunity to thank this amazing panel and the speakers for their interventions and also for comments. I think it would be fair to say, just hearing you all speak, that despite despite the growing anti-Gypsyism, unfortunately, in many of the member states in the EU, but also if we speak about enlargement countries, including in Turkey, we have this growing anti-Gypsyism. But on the other hand, I think it would be fair to say that we are in a much better place when it comes to fighting anti-Gypsyism than we were 10 years ago, for instance. And also looking at what Tamás has said, that also with the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, we have seen this increase of anti-Gypsyism much more visibly because of this growing disproportionate impact between the situation of Roma and Sinti and traveler communities and everybody else, and how the different manifestations of anti-Gypsyism impacted on these communities. We see still that there's been this growing awareness at the level of European institutions and international organizations, mostly when it comes to the need to fight anti-Gypsyism. And I think the fact that EU has taken this leadership role by the adoption of the EU Roma Framework for equality, inclusion, and participation, and also the Council of the European Union by the recommendation in March this year, I think this really says that about the need to tackle anti-Gypsyism, both not just on an individual level, but everybody here has mentioned the importance of tackling anti-Gypsyism on a very structural and institutional level. And here where I guess the challenges that all you have addressed today are very relevant to mention. Also in the work, if you allow me, Angelica, in the work of FRA, because you mentioned how difficult to switch from the concept of anti-Gypsyism to actually try and monitor, but also to collect data on. And I think the challenge for FRA is also to move in a way from collecting information on the perception of discrimination by many Roma communities to actually trying to help us go to fighting structural and institutional discrimination and racism against Roma, and how we are able to collect this type of data. I think this is where we have ahead of us as a challenge, and definitely the indicators that FRA worked together on with member states under the Working Party are a small starting point in that direction. But I think now with the design of the national Roma strategies by the member states, we will have to really see like how far they actually went to implementing this, the targets and the indicators that were set for all the member states, and even the extra efforts to actually look at the specific conditions in member states and try to come up with very specific type of indicators in monitoring anti-Gypsyism. Right, and don't forget that one of these big steps was also indicated by the Commission that we should fight it in the strategies, not just as a standalone, but also cross-cuttingly. So hopefully that would give us the opportunity to look at other forms of manifestations that we were not able to catch so far. So when we look at what we have, we also have this growing if you want awareness, and I think Bernard, you talked about it, that we have a lot of recognition, or a lot more than we had before, both in terms of terminology, but also in terms of phenomena at member states, but mostly amongst stakeholders. But what we are still missing, again, we're coming back to the same issue, is fighting this structural and systemic anti-Gypsyism, right? Because unfortunately, the data that we have so far talks about these individual acts of anti-Gypsyism. This is also the work of the equality bodies. The complaints that are coming in to the equality bodies are mostly on an individual basis. And we don't really have these mechanisms to look more structurally. So that's also something for the equality bodies, I would say, Tamás, to find also ways of how we could actually collect data on such a thing. Now with the data collection, and I know also this was mentioned, and Guillermo, I know you're also sensitive to this, is that there is still difficulty in many countries to collect ethnic data because sometimes of very difficult legislative frameworks that impedes the collection of such data. And while we have some good examples, and Angelica mentioned some of the countries that already do this work on their own, I think we haven't really exhausted some of the opportunities that the Racial Equality Directives provides when it comes to the provision of positive action. So I think also it's maybe within the remit of equality bodies, Equinet, and Fundamental Rights Agency as well, to promote a more awareness on this provision, on possibility, and to work with the member states to make sure that they collect such ethnic data using the positive action model. We also spoke about how important in the process of a design of national Roma strategies is or should be the Roma participation. And I think that this is a, if you want, a negative point in many countries where unfortunately we haven't seen a lot of structured participation or mechanisms of participation to involve Roma and civil society organizations in the design of the strategies, and to make sure that we really give this boost of Roma empowerment. And Bernard here really talked about the previous experience of the independent monitoring reports provided by many civil society organizations under the Roma Civil Monitor. The positive thing is that this time around, under the new cycle of the EU Roma Framework, Roma civil society and other pro-Roma civil society organizations will have the opportunity yet again to conduct this independent monitoring and to provide their own views and experiences, if you want, even in the implementation of the national Roma strategies. But then we also have this ongoing frustration of the political will to actually make sure that we're not just monitoring something that didn't happen, but we are also monitoring positive responses by governments in fighting anti-Gypsyism in a more convincing way, right? So then Markus talked about and took us a little bit through the example of Germany, while coaching us, making us cautious of the fact that while it may seem positive that Germany made this huge step in having its own commission on anti-Gypsyism, it's not always that positive in that sense. And also when it comes to structural racism, Germany itself has a problem of acknowledging it as a phenomenon that is taking place. So I guess, I mean, I would agree with all of you when you said that it's really, how do we make sure that we are not going to monitor in this new cycle, just continue to monitor this individual acts of discrimination and racism against Roma, that we are really addressing the issue at its very core. Otherwise, we are just going to, unfortunately, be just addressing the anti-Gypsyism at a very low point without actually changing things in a structure manner. So maybe one, and this is I will end with this. Maybe one way is also to make sure that we try to mainstream the fight against anti-Gypsyism within really the bigger frame of fighting racism for all racialized minorities. We see there's a lot of solidarity in the field, but I think also under the new EU Action Plan Against Racism, there are several opportunities for us to come together and to show not just that the phenomenon of anti-Gypsyism exists, but actually that it creates similarity. It has similarities with other fights of other groups that pertain here in Europe, and maybe fighting together, we will find a way to fight anti-Gypsyism more effectively than before. So Guillermo, I think it's the time for me to stop here. I'll give the floor to just thank everybody, and I would like to take the 1 second to thank everybody again, and also those watching, and asking them to continue to do the fight, even if sometimes it feels like we are doing this work for nothing, but it's not for nothing. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Isabela, for your concluding remarks and for your statements and for your call for solidarity among racialized groups in the fight against racism in the society. Many thanks to our panelists today, and I wish you a very nice day. Bye.